or at least I would include myself among the people who say, I have no idea. The good news is today we have a panel that's in a position to talk about, if not the solution, the framework by which a solution can be approached. And with that, I turn it over to Brent Henry, who will introduce the panel.
Thank you, Pat. We're mic'd. Yep. Thank you, Pat. My name is Brent Henry. I'm the former general counsel at Partners Healthcare, now a partner at Mintz Levin in the healthcare division. And as Pat said, the focus of this panel is really on standards and regulation. The reality being that, given the fact that over the past day and a half, we've heard a lot about the promise of AI and what AI can do to change clinical care. And the question is not only does it work, but where does the data come from? How do you know you have the correct data? How do you protect that data? What happens when you have to go before the most well-known regulatory body, that is the FDA? What kind of hurdles and challenges do you have there? And then at the end, once you bring it to market, what happens if it doesn't work? Who sustains the liability, for example? So we're going to explore all those questions, and we have a great panel with us. I will just introduce them by name, but I'll ask them right after I run through who's up here to tell you a little bit more about what they do. So to my immediate right, we have Michael Spadafore, and Michael is the investment manager for the Blue Cross Blue Shield Venture Partners Funds. To his right, we have Bakul Patel. Bakul is the Director of Digital Health Division at the FDA. To Bakul's right, we have my colleague, Bethany Hills, who is the chair of the Mintz Levin FDA practice. To Bethany's right, we have Diane Johnson, who's Senior Director for Regulatory Affairs, Policy, and Intelligence in the North America division at, at Johnson & Johnson. And to Diane's right, we have Michelle McMurry-Heath, who is the Vice President for Global and Regulatory Affairs, International Clinical Evidence at Johnson & Johnson. Unfortunately, Michelle's going to have to depart early, but she assures me that Diane will more than adequately fill her space. So, so that's the panel, but let's go a little bit deeper. Michael, you want to talk a little bit more about what you do?
Yeah, sure, happy to. So as Brent said, Mike Spadafore, and I work closely in the Blue Cross Blue Shield Venture Funds, which is a partnership between the firm I work with, Sandbox Industries, and 29 of the Blue Cross plans. And our focus is on investing in emerging technology companies that have strategic relevance in and around healthcare, particularly health plans. So we spend a bunch of our time in the clinical space, diagnostics companies, digital therapeutics, as well as healthcare tech-enabled services, and other things that improve the administration of healthcare. So spend a lot of time with entrepreneurs and helping them build their companies.
Hi, I'm Bakul Patel. I'm the director for the newly formed division of digital health at FDA. I spend a lot of my time thinking about strategy and policy of where FDA can be a partner in allowing digital health technologies to sort of be, one, useful for the patients, but also getting as close as possible to get these technologies to the market, to the patients as fast as we can. I think and spend a lot of my time and my team's time on reimagining how we should think about this and look at what the regulatory structures and incentives we can be providing, at the same time protecting patients. So that's sort of the goal and intent of the work I do at the agency. It's been really rewarding. I've been there for 10 years, and I didn't know I would be there for 10 years, but I'm there now. I'm still there. And on a journey towards actually making the world of digital health and emerging technologies for good for us as individuals, as patients.
Great. I'm Bethany Hills. As Brent mentioned, I'm the chair of the FDA practice at Mintz Levin, and what I do is really help companies who are potentially regulated, sometimes they want to be, sometimes not, by the FDA structure. That's sort of the one coalescing factor, is that they all may be regulated in the life science and diagnostic or drug space. and help them figure out how best to approach a regulatory strategy, combine it with a reimbursement strategy, work on a lot of the legal issues. So I am, other than Brent, who is former general counsel of Partners, I'm a token attorney on the panel. So I will address some risk issues, some of the scary things that we think about in liability, and also just some of the bias and issues that the data presents when we're talking about accuracy and does it work. It's not just about getting through the FDA process. It's definitely broader than that.
So my responsibilities are focused largely on the digital health area, in particular those products that are regulated. I work across the farm, medical device, and consumer divisions within Johnson & Johnson and try to promote global harmonization across all the regulators who are currently looking at regulating these sorts of products, including standing up new types of regulatory authorities.
And Diane is our digital health guru for the 160,000 people who work at J&J. My name's Michelle McMurry-Heath, and I lead the regulatory affairs group and the international clinical affairs group for the medical device companies at Johnson & Johnson. Our companies range from Ethicon, which is a general surgery company, to Biosense Webster, which works on ablating cardiac tissue, to breast implants, to orthopedics companies. So we have a range of medical devices at various levels of risk. And software as a medical device is becoming a more important aspect of all of those businesses. And our teams are global. We have about 140,000 unique SKUs in about 160 markets around the world. So dealing with the complexity of this regulatory space and that changing landscape is been fun, most definitely.
So as you can see, we have people with lots of experience. So I should just say that you can ask questions via the website, and that's all I know. I don't know the mechanics of how to do this, but Pat, I don't know if you do.
No, I think people just connect through the app and then it shows up on your iPad.
Okay, so just let me know. I have the questions here if you want to ask them. But let me start with my colleague, Bethany. Bethany, you just said that you obviously advise a whole range of companies on a whole range of products and ideas. How do you let them know that they're going to be, what kind of advice do you give them when they come to you and they say, we've got this great idea? How do you become the kind of leavening factor to say, yeah, but there are things that there are hurdles you have to clear? What do you say to them? What kind of issues do you raise?
So if someone comes to us with AI as being the main discussion point that they want to talk about, usually I start by saying, okay, AI is a tool, AI is a feature, AI is the mechanism of how you're accomplishing something with your product, but let's take a step back and what is your product? What is it that you're actually trying to accomplish and try to do? And then we can do an assessment and figure out whether that product is regulated. And I think Bakul will speak about this, the fact that it has AI in it and it's touching healthcare doesn't mean that it's necessarily a regulated product. And then regardless of whether or not it's regulated, we're looking at issues like risk and liability to make sure that the data that you have is good quality, that the judgments or the decisions or the predictions and probabilities that your software tool is pumping out is actually something that's reliable. And so we talk a lot about what studies have you done, how have you compared this information, what kind of validation, verification. We definitely are, trying to understand where the product fits in the workflow, and what it is that the clinicians are they going to rely on it? Who's going to be the user of this product? And once we can assess all of that, then we can start thinking about risk. So really, a lot of the initial conversations are trying to understand what are you really doing, and where is the product? Another thing that I mentioned, because this comes up more and more often, is who's involved. Because Partners, for example, has great clinicians, but are they actually the developer of a particular software? Or maybe they bring in an external party, an outside software team that's going to help with a special product or some kind of data aggregation. And suddenly we've got 2 or 3 or 4 parties involved in developing a product or a solution. And there starts to become intellectual property issues and liability issues, and also just issues of defining who's actually managing the process, confidentiality, data privacy. So the area is pretty broad.
So lots to unpack. We
Yeah.
won't get to all of those things, but thanks for kind of giving us the landscape, because I find all too often folks coming with ideas don't have a full appreciation for everything that needs to be considered. Probably one of the most prominent areas of consideration, however, for products that a lot of folks would like to think will be blockbusters is the FDA. And I know, Bakul, you've been on the speaker circuit for quite some time talking about how the FDA is trying to get its hands around AI. And this is a timely panel because just last week you guys released a very provocative discussion paper. So do you want to tell us a little bit more about FDA's approach, the PreCert program, and what you're trying to accomplish with the discussion paper?
Absolutely. Can I just see a raise of hands so people know about this paper? Quite a few. That's great. So now I know how to frame this question, so we'll start there. One of the things that we actually highlighted in the paper is we recognize, one, that this field is moving, but we have taken it further and said, we also recognize that there's the space where things will evolve every encounter the algorithm has. So we'll talk about locked algorithms or batched algorithms, if you may, to continuously learning or adaptive algorithms. So not just starting with where we are today, where most of the solutions today are in the space of batched algorithms. What we proposed is how do we sort of come up with a total product lifecycle approach, which doesn't necessarily mean just getting to market is the only point that we should worry about, or we as in collectively, the makers, the users, the FDA, everybody should worry about it, just that the products got in market, because we very well know that products, especially in this space, will change. So the intent of the paper is to start this conversation about how do you move from an episodic way of oversight from FDA or independent party to then start looking at a continuous way of making sure there's assurance of safety and effectiveness of these products along the way. I think it's the best interest, like Bethany mentioned, it's not just about one thing that getting to market, but it's also looking at it holistically from the time it has been created to the time it's being used and while it's being used. So that's sort of the rubric. The proposal on the table is, if we, just like you would do a business planning, like where your company wants to go in the future, if you can plan your product to know where it's going to go in the future, and if you have the right mechanism, capacity, processes to sort of make sure that it can happen in that space, again, bounded by what you're intending to do with the product, then I think there's a conversation that we can have while the product has been reviewed, an agreement that within those specifications, we know how to manage change. And if we come to that same agreement between FDA and the product maker, we can allow those changes to happen while the product's being used. So that's the proposal. Now, I won't use a lot of acronyms, but the paper is filled with those. One we call as pre-specifications. Second is change control protocols. And those go hand in hand. When you pre-specify where you want to go change, or you think your products, based on the input data that you're going to train your algorithm, will change to this boundary, you can go ahead and change it because you have these change protocols in place. We are assured that you can manage those changes up to that certain point. And again, there are different scenarios laid out in the paper which talks about if it's just a small change, what do you do? Or we find out accidentally that the change protocol had to be evolved over time because we've gotten more knowledgeable in what we know, and we got evolved in our thinking. And there's proposals about how to make those interactions with FDA, that assurance we continue to stay on the same page. So it's really a paper which talks about how does FDA stay on the same page as you're monitoring and using the product or deploying the product out in the space.
So I've already gotten 2 questions from the audience, so I'll follow on to what you've just said. So you've obviously provoked some some activity here. The first is, how do you think about applying your regulatory processes for a product that includes machine learning, and thus the product could be continually changing?
So that's exactly what I mentioned, is products that are continually changing will evolve over time. Products that are continually changing would also have, I mean, you as, let's just say, imagine for a second you're the CEO of this company and you're asking your development team to go create a continuous learning product. And the next question you'll ask is, how do you know this product is going to maintain the performance that you initially designed for? And really what we're asking folks to think about is, like, plan that out. And it's okay to sort of at least know ahead of time where you're going to grow and how you're going to grow and how you're going to manage that growth. Last thing we want from a public health perspective and patient safety perspective is it's by chance you have unintended consequences to create a safety issue where if it's not planned, it's not managed, it actually could hurt somebody. And that just not raises FDA's concern, but it probably raises other business concerns for yourself. So if it's probably in best interest for you as a company, as an organization, as well as in better interest for public and patient safety to think about this ahead of time. And if we all are on the same page of how those changes can happen, I think that's really what we are looking for. But there are questions in the paper. I think we're looking for smarter solutions than we could come up with. The paper is a starting point. Think about it from that perspective. Let us know how you would think about it, because that's the framing thing that we wanted to sort of put out.
So the next question is this. Software development is very frequently an outsourced activity in the medtech industry. How will the software PreCert program authorize third-party development companies?
Well, we're at the risk of actually going into PreCert discussion, which could take an entire day, but I'll answer this one.
Okay.
The concept in the PreCertification program is very simple. We know software development doesn't happen all under one roof, not on the same computer. It'll be so easy, right, if you did that. But it is very distributed. Sometimes outsourced, sometimes the clinical parts are outsourced, and that is no foreign to medical device makers. You have your core competencies as businesses. You don't have today. You may have the luxury to sort of build it all in-house, but the buy versus build has always been a question that doesn't just apply to medtech industry, but also applies to other industry. The question really boils down to, for pre-certification, if you're going to rely on somebody that's building stuff for you, and let it be a piece of software or entire suite of software, I think at the end of the day, how would you get that assurance that it's been working? So we would want to think about pre-certification as, like, do you have controls over that? It is no different than supplier controls as we deploy today. We may get into, we need to explore a little bit more, because even that can be unraveled into further. But I think the concept is very akin to what we have today. When you say you should be in control of your supplier, how do you know you're getting what you're supposed to get? How do you look for those outcomes? How do you monitor them? And so it's not a gap in a gap in risk that can actually lead to something harmful.
And how good is your contract with your supplier? How good is your contract with your supplier? I mean, that's a long-term relationship. That's a marriage that you've just established. And especially if you're going to then go through the PreCert program and constantly be in front of the FDA together, you better have a pretty strong partnership and have that structured well. I'm sure you guys are dealing with that.
That's a good segue. Michelle and Diane, Johnson & Johnson is fortunate to be in the PreCert program. How have you found that?
Diane's been our director of it, Diane.
So it's been in many ways a traditional FDA pilot. In this particular pilot around software, we've kind of taken the approach, we being the agency, and the participants, of seeing whether or not we could develop a program within the current statutory authorities so that we could go ahead and deploy something in the short term. So the process looks at an excellence appraisal, which is not an inspection, but kind of like a college admission activity, where you go ahead and show on the front end that you have core competencies around software development. Been very interesting in the sense that we've been able to move forward concepts around building quality systems that are more appropriate for the software environment and not trying to shoehorn them into classic design controls with piles of paper. So that is, I think, going to be quite important, especially for non-medical device companies that are looking to get into the medical device arena. And then also some of the really interesting concepts have come around the fact that you can and you do instrument software to give you immediate feedback. And with many medical devices, you're kind of doing passive post-market surveillance and waiting for the phone to ring and finding out something is not going as intended. Where with software, you can actually build it to tell you that right away. It facilitates the iterative cycles for updating, but it also gives you real-time information to support not only the performance of the product, but the performance of your own software development systems. So it really does feed this iterative cycle, and we think that going through this appraisal process and then having a streamlined review or no review, depending on kind of the risk of the product, really will facilitate giving the patients these improved patient outcomes that we're looking at across the continuum of care. So it's been very exciting. And it's also been able to give us an opportunity to better understand kind of the international documents that were written around software, and they were authored primarily by FDA, and it's giving us such a deep understanding of the concepts there that it's afforded us an opportunity to try and take these concepts and make sure that there's a reasonably aligned approach across other jurisdictions, so that we have, the software may not be the same in all the countries, but at least some of the fundamental questions, like is it regulated or is it not, would be similar.
And as I look across the corporation, I think there's a lot of excitement from our leadership about our participation in PreCert, the ability to have this dialogue and back and forth in shaping the direction of how the regulation's going. What keeps me up at night about it, as I watch Diane really struggle with it and the company wrap their head around it, is that we are really a conglomeration of a lot of independent small companies in many ways. We have company group chairmen that like to run their part of the business in very distinct ways with distinct styles. But an important tenet of the PreCert program is that you go to the agency and agree to comport yourself in a certain manner going forward. And those assurances are what get you your pre-certification. And while there is an acknowledgement that you might have multiple divisions with multiple cultures and styles, you really do have to at least agree to meet those minimum requirements and assurances and continue to meet them going forward. So just making sure everyone stays on the same page, I think, is going to be critically important. And then as I look at our products internationally as well, it's such a different paradigm than any of the other international medical regulators are ready to pursue, even though they look at it as a beacon, as the gold standard of where they want to go. I just worry how we catch up as we try to internationalize our portfolio. So those are the two things I think we struggle with.
Can I just make a comment?
Sure.
I think, Michelle, you just sparked a thought into me, which I should have mentioned. The whole idea of PreCert has been drive towards excellence and not drive towards just compliance, right? So you can I think about compliance as that's the minimum bar, and excellence is like you strive for the best, right? And we want people striving for the best. So even in your situation where you have many subsidiaries or many divisions working to strive for the best in their own little way, for their own little application, I'm excited to see like if this leads to modeling entire J&J after what's best and what has worked for that one small company who may be more nimble, more innovative, more efficient, more caring about things, might actually become a model that will raise everything else. I think that's sort of the hope we had. is if we strive people to compete on excellence, I think overall as a public health agency, we would win. I think that's really the goal.
And I think if we were just dealing with the medical device companies of Johnson & Johnson, that would be one thing, or any of the other major corporations out there. But because software touches the pharmaceutical sector of our company and the consumer sector, and folks who don't even realize that they're designing software as a medical device when they are doing something, it becomes much more complex. And we've had to put in place a governance process just to help, surface projects and ideas that people don't even realize that that's what they're building and that it falls under the agency's purview.
A couple more questions that are coming up from the audience, Bakul, that I want to direct to you, and then I want to give Mike a chance to weigh in, because not everything that's involved in AI is regulated by the FDA. But the two FDA-related questions are, what's the timeline to translate the PreCert program from a concept to a reality that developers can take advantage of? That's one. And the second is, how do you harmonize with other countries, the guidances that you plan to develop?
So timing for the PreCert program, we've been very transparent about this. So last year we spent building it, sort of conceptualizing it, getting it to the next level from a very high level concept to actually being able to go try it out. So this is the tryout. I call it a test year. And I call it test year for a couple of reasons. Is we think we have a good solution. Now we actually need to try to do it and use our current regulatory authorities like the de novo pathway to figure out we can actually yield the answer. We know that if we did an excellence appraisal for a company and then we took the smaller subset of content that we see in a pre-market submission, can we get to the same answer of, yes, we agree this product should be in the marketplace? And if we can run that test this year, this is the hope, that we want to get that. In order for us to sort of take advantage, for people who want to be part of the program and take advantage, I would say this year, if you can help us inform with your perspectives on how excellence appraisal can happen, what the content we had just put out saying this is reduced content because we're going to add excellence appraisal results with the content to get to the same decision. Help us build that from your perspectives, because the 9 companies we have, however, it is such a small sample. What we would like to see is to get people to see, will it work for you at the end of the day? And that's what we want to hear. The second question I forgot the question.
How do you harmonize with international?
So I think Diane started talking about that. We spend about 5 years, actually spend with a bunch of international colleagues, spend about 5 years trying to get to a framework that is understandable, maybe not at the detail level, but at least at a grounding level for how we should look at software as a medical device. To be honest, the term software as a medical device did not exist until we started that effort. It used to be called something else, standalone software, which doesn't make any sense to me. So we coined this word, the software as a medical device, to really surface how we should think about it. And then now we are at a spot where we have a framework that we can start off from. And what you're seeing in the PreCert program is how do you apply that framework to a regulatory system that actually be yielding the intent of what we are here for as an agency to promote and protect public health. So that's what we are doing. Now, can this approach be applicable in other countries? I believe it can be, but we have to prove it first here before we actually sit down and figure out what the harmonization is going to look like. I'm actually very hopeful that results of this program, and if we were to try it out and be successful, others will follow. And I say that because I get phone calls and emails from my international colleagues. I just recently got an email from somebody from Singapore asking me, how did you do a certain thing? And that attention that people are having on this program is actually promising for me. So it will happen, I believe. I don't think we're going to jump right now and say we should harmonize internationally. That's really be a big world hunger to solve for me. Right?
So Mike, obviously everything doesn't require FDA approval, and I know Blue Cross Blue Shield is looking at some applications of AI that don't, I guess anywhere from consumer to health insurance related, et cetera. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of the risks the risk profiles that you consider when you decide whether to invest?
Sure. Yeah. And I, by the way, I've just been taking great notes. This cruise is really impressive and fun to listen to. I think on our end, I think I go back to what Bethany said at the beginning. When we get a lot of AI pitches, hundreds a year of people saying, hey, AI enabled this and that. And we always come back to the market opportunity in the business model. What's the cost that we're taking out? Are we replacing people in this process? And does that have corresponding risk? We have spent more and more time in a lot of the FDA regulated space or things that are regulated by other regulatory industries, CLIA and others. The vast majority of what we've done is probably more focused on the administrative layer. I think it's remarkable how much waste when you dig in can be replaced with things like robotic process automation and AI, and how much inefficiency there is just in the triage to the right provider is an area that we spend quite a bit of time on. When someone presents with an episode of pain, more often they're going and seeing a doctor based on a Facebook group recommendation than real clinical data. So we've spent a lot of time in that area. I'd say the other thing that we find remarkable when it comes to risk is it's a really cool time to be in healthcare. We have some companies that are building solutions that would have took $40 or $50 million, 4 or 5 years ago, able to do it on $8 million because there's an abundance of partners. We recently backed a company called Octave Biosciences, which is essentially building 3 companies in one, where they're building a biomarker test to understand disease activity in MS, concurrently with a solution to understand radiology images and MRIs, concurrently with more of the digital biomarkers and that piece. And so one side of you says, wow, you can do all of this with partnerships now and create this consolidated data asset that truly helps the patient. On the flip side, and hearing this conversation, the interesting part is how do you think about those suppliers? And how do you think about the data outputs that are coming from those suppliers, and how do you manage quality in those things if if that is the foundation of what you're building? And so we have a lot of conversations around the byproducts of how companies are getting built and whose responsibility on the chain is it if data goes wrong.
So let's talk a little bit about data. I mean, J&J is obviously a huge company. You purchase data information. You obviously have your own data, excuse me, that you use to build algorithms. How do you acquire it? How do you protect it? How do you make sure that it's secure?
Well, we recently brought on a cybersecurity leader that cuts across the enterprise, meaning all parts of J&J. And I think they've been pretty busy the last couple of years since they've been in place. We tried to be very, very proactive, and I'll just use an example. Before we moved out of the diabetes space, we partnered with FDA on a kind of cybersecurity summit where we brought in our developers and FDA staffers and invited people to try to break our glucose monitors for a day to try to see where some of the vulnerabilities were so we could understand some of the concerns that patients might have, and we could get back to our R&D staff about how we improve the device so that it's more secure for the patients using it. And I think that really kind of underscores one of the key tenets of the cybersecurity debate, which is the public confidence. And it was interesting, there was a lot of news coverage of that partnership, and a lot of it was about the vulnerabilities we uncovered as opposed to the partnership and the proactivity around trying to identify those things early so we could solve them. So there's this conundrum. The more we talk about cybersecurity, the more we undermine the public confidence. And yet we need to call attention to these areas, and we need to invest in these areas, and we need to find solutions.
So Bethany, just taking off on what Michelle just said, what happens when something goes wrong? Do you and your clients think much about the ultimate liability? Obviously, if there's an FDA-approved product, there's some protection there, but a lot of these products aren't.
Yes, and many of them should be and aren't, but we'll leave that to the regulators to decide. Certainly there is. We talk with a lot of our the clinical workflow facilities, whether it's a doctor, whether it's actually physician practices, and trying. It is very difficult to find out, especially when you're dealing with AI-driven solutions, what went wrong. So we have to. So I do mostly FDA work, and I thinking root cause analysis. This is a complaint. Do you have a reportable event? But if you think about it from a clinician or facility standpoint, you need to do that same risk management. What went wrong? Where was the problem? Do we know that it was correct or incorrect? So we see some clinical decision support tools that are facility-wide that might, natural language process and have lots of different databases to do decision support on give antibiotics, don't give antibiotics, medication interference, helping with diagnosis. And there's a real challenge in the adoption of clinicians, whether or not that they find that information useful, the pop-up boxes that happen, sort of the interference. We talk about workflow, but it's really hard to get the root cause analysis when something is wrong. And sometimes the data is imperfect and the analysis is imperfect. And if it's wrong and a medication is delivered that shouldn't have been delivered, or an intervention is taken or not taken, we have public confidence and patient issues. There's definitely product liability. And, as the scary lawyer on the stage is, the problem here is, how do we document all of that? We can't really find where it went wrong if there's any black box functionality going on. And then if there's black box functionality going on by a third-party service provider, that's even harder. That's not something in the control of the facility. And so whether or not that information is properly documented, it becomes a problem in a litigation. There's patient confidence issues that we talked about. And then, like I said, the uptake of the clinicians, it could just be that clinicians, they're either ignoring. So I've seen a lot of behavioral studies around the use of AI products in healthcare, that there is also a resistance to the specialists in utilizing and actually engaging with that technology, because either it's wrong too often and they just don't even want to deal with it, so they click past it or aren't engaging with it. And there's no good way to gather data on the studies, the ability for us to actually know where the problem happened. I think that's the mystery here, is we can't even really assess the risk because we do have a hard time figuring out where things went wrong. An analogy is in a data breach situation, talking about cybersecurity. When you have a data breach situation, you need to figure out who got the information incorrectly, when did it happen, where did the flow go. You have to trace all of this in a very documented fashion, and it has become very complex to do, given the level of electronic records that we have. And so I think that's where what we think of as lawyers in the liability standpoint is, you may have some protection from a product liability, and honestly, the best protection is not really the FDA approval. It's the complete lack of understanding. Like, the patient doesn't even know the doctor didn't make the decision, that AI made the decision. And so there is a little bit of transparency there that's almost shrouded in mystery, which protects some of the product liability. But these are issues that we do have to deal with pretty regularly, unfortunately.
Go ahead, Mike.
On that point, one of the boards that I'm on is of a data breach company, actually manages data breaches on behalf of enterprises. And one of the things we found recently is the breach reporting requirements are even hard to interpret. There was a wave 2 years ago of a lot of ransomware where people were taking control of an environment, but the data never left the four walls. And a lot of companies were interpreting that not as a breach event, which is pretty fascinating. But I will say, from our perspective on the company building side, sitting in the stage of a CEO of an early stage company, where really the rub hits with most of our companies is around how do you protect yourself from an insurance perspective. And I'd say that's a very immature market today in terms of cyber insurance. And at least in the case of a lot of the health insurers that we work with, they're pushing unlimited liability onto companies in many cases, which is a pretty contentious part of every contract negotiation we've been going through lately. And we found some of our companies actually even have to go to Europe to get large enough policies to cover that contract liability. So it's an interesting time because of that uncertainty.
Yeah, just piggybacking on that, when you have, let's say, decision support software, that's not necessarily FDA regulated or approved, then the question is, does the liability fall on the clinician for either using it and interpreting it wrongly or not deciding to take advantage of the decision support? I mean, obviously there are issues of standards of care, but that's all evolving. Do you talk to malpractice insurers as well when you look at insurance coverage?
It's a great question. A lot of our companies don't typically have a malpractice insurance policy. It's usually more around cyber.
Right.
And we actually have invested in a malpractice insurer as well. So I should ask them, the actuaries, how they think about that, because I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
There was a question that came up during the discussion here that kind of spans, Bethany, what you mentioned, but also, Bakul, your guy on the hot seat today, touches on the FDA. And the question is, can you talk a bit about the future of, quote, explainable AI, unquote, and the issue that black box algorithms, especially in the deep learning realm, pose for transparency? Is that out of bounds for FDA approval?
I don't even understand the question, but I'll attempt. So I guess the question is hinting towards how transparent is transparent and how explainable something that is trained with data without actually being being through a controlled study that sort of gets to. So it sort of points to that whole nature of machine learning that is based on evidence that was created before, and we are looking for patterns, and how do you correlate those patterns to future. So when you think about that entire thing, it's actually the way I think about it, rather than FDA. I'll just tell you how I think about it. I think about it as like us as humans. We go to school, we get trained, and you ask somebody to explain what do you know. You could sit there and write a resume. You could sit there and explain your story about how you got to where you got to. You could sit there and go on TED stage and talk about your journey through life. So there's many ways to explain that. The question for AI and to use AI explainability, I think is for me is, and there's research being done in this area about what's the learning that happened. So today, the equivalent of what's learning that's happened, that at least the thought process has been, is what has it been trained with? And if we know what has it been trained with, it's like saying, what books did you read will tell me how good you are in the knowledge that you absorb, but it really doesn't get you to like, what did you retain? And I think that's the scientific exercise that needs to happen in the world of AI that everybody is driving towards, is how do I explain what was learned? So having a set of numbers on a bunch of neurons that's in a deep neural network does not really tell you anything. So that's question number one. The second part is, at the point of use, there needs to be some way of explaining to the user at the time of use, what is it that they're looking at? I think that's when so it's not about just explain one thing, write a resume, or done for the AI tool. It is about this goes back to my first premise, is it can be one and done. It can be so episodic that if you explain and write in a piece of paper, you're done, or tape it, or whatever you want to say. It is about knowing what was trained with, what it actually retained, and what you're exposing to the user. That's transparency to me. It's more holistic than just talking about it at one point in time.
So Bakul, building on that analogy, do you foresee the FDA regulating not just what you learned and how you learned it, but the rate at which you learned it? Will you consider some devices failing for not learning quickly enough?
I think that's definitely a way to think about it from a I think at the bottom line, what should the user care when he or she is using that information in front of it? Or if it's not a user, and I use the user in a very broad sense because the user could be a machine doing something else or a human acting on that information, right? So what is it that it needs to know? The user needs to know. That's really the important part. It's like saying that, and a very simple analogy, right? You take a picture, you know where it was taken, what's the metadata that goes with it, right? So what's that metadata that goes with that recommendation that comes with it? Will actually then be able to tell people what is it that you need to do with that, how much to rely on it. I think that's really what it is. So from a regulations perspective, we want to create this level of standardization that people are thinking about this, the behavior is on the right place, the information that's shared with not only the users, but also the thought process that went into it. So if you look at the paper, it touches on all those things.
So using your college admission analogy, so if both pieces of software got an 1800 on the SAT, but it took 3 patients to learn a certain element or to learn an answer, and it took the other one only 1 patient, is that an adverse event? Those 2 extra patients that were required to get to that 1800, is that an adverse event in your eyes?
I don't know the answer to calling it. I wouldn't jump to labeling it as adverse event. I would say we need to find out what the right standard should be. So does everybody has to, let's just make this up. Well, we're making 2 versus 1, or 3 versus 1 patient. If 3 is the right answer for that particular modality in that particular application, we need to know what that standard looks like. And that's not a regulatory thing. It's actually more of a industry user thing that we need to get to a consensus on. Is that the kind of algorithm should be in that particular practice? I was speaking to somebody earlier. We were talking about a very specific medical discipline, and that could be very different than another medical discipline, right? And the standard doesn't have to be one, but really the principles of what the standards should be derived on, based on, is something that the regulations sort of can help.
So let's talk a little bit about the data underlying some of those issues. In other words, if you don't feel that you have a very broad range of data, does it make, and I'm looking at the J&J folks here, does it make sense to then try to design a product around AI that's based on that limited data, or do you simply wait until you've got broader data to have a broader customer base?
I'm thinking of an example in our vision business recently, and it was actually using an AI-like platform to try to get the data. When I was on a panel recently when we were talking about whether or not a traditional clinical trial could ever be used to get to an answer around precision medicine, where the ideal is an N of 1. So when you're really trying to get to an answer that is so multifactorial, the only way you're going to get there is by trying to collect a ton of data and learn over time. So I think this is the challenge. You need these AI tools to try to answer some of these precision medicine, customized care answers and questions, but at the same time you need to regulate them in a public health space to make sure that they're treating the patients that are contacted along the way in a fair and efficacious way. So it's a challenge. It's a balance.
So I do have a couple more questions from the audience. The one is, to the extent, again, this is to you, Bakul, to the extent that smartphones are client devices for an AI device, what is the FDA position on regulating the smartphone environment?
Can you repeat that first part, sorry?
To the extent that smartphones are client devices for an AI, quote, device, I know there's a double use of devices there. What is the FDA position on regulating the smartphone environment? I guess that's really the question. What is your position on smartphones?
So we actually said smartphones are platforms. And that's something that we said in 2013, where we don't regulate platforms. It's the use And then software that uses that platform has to consider the risk of what platform they're choosing. That's just basic engineering 101, right? I think it's just like anything else. You pick to choose to drive a car. You drive the car based on what you think is necessary, right? So I think that's really what it boils down to. So the regulations don't talk about the platforms. The regulations talk about the function that you're intending as a maker of a product, medical product, and you decide to pick a platform, and you know what you're going to rely on or not rely on, is really what the thinking that we need to do. It goes back to the risk management discussion that Bethany was starting off with. It's about what risk are you willing to take on, and how are you going to manage them and mitigate them, and make sure the regulations don't limit you to say you will use X platform or Y platform. You basically say that for that function that you're trying to make, you make the right choice, and we expect you to make sure that the risks that for patient harm are mitigated.
So I was going to say, Mike, I'm sure you have some experience with that.
I think that's really interesting advice. I think from our perspective, we're starting to see a layer of companies that are trying to create some validity and legitimacy within that hardware layer. Obviously, you're seeing Apple do it with Apple Watch and some other things, but even just sensors like sticker sensors that do heart rate, respiratory rate, steps, et cetera. You know, if you're trying to build an FDA-approved device that relies on a step counter, is the Fitbit data output good enough? You know, I can shake that thing or attach it to my dog and all the other stuff that people do in those step sessions. But I think what we're interested in is there are a bunch of companies that are starting to look at that layer and say, you know, how do we become, you know, a software as a medical device or FDA approved for fall detection, for these specific use cases, so that they can build the foundation on which other things can be built on top of. And then I think that ultimately becomes a business question. Do you want to pay for something that has that type of you know, efficacy, or something that's a little bit more off the shelf and that ties into the liability that you're taking?
So Bethany, we talked a little bit about data. How do you advise your clients to think about acquiring the data that they use to develop AI?
Yeah, it's we were talking about this earlier as we were prepping. First of all, I just do want to mention, you know, GSK just paid $300 million to access and be able to use the 23andMe database. And so that's a pretty valuable database, and we're not really sure exactly what they're doing with it. So I think there's a bunch of issues there. There was in JAMA in December, there was an article indicating that essentially HIPAA is obsolete. Given AI and the fact that artificial intelligence exists, using the Fitbit examples and otherwise, to the extent that consumer data is getting mixed in with healthcare data, you can strip the identity. It's a very well-written study, so if you haven't looked at it, you should take a look at it. The fact that you're mixing consumer data with healthcare data, and you de-identify the healthcare data, you remove those identifiers, but then you take an AI tool, like it sounds like that Michelle was mentioning, you know, building something to go and acquire the data and understand what you have, those AI functions are easily able to piece it back together. So you can remove all of the identifiers, but because there's consumer, you know, behavioral information coming from your Facebook usage or from your step counter and GPS related information that may not be healthcare, but it's being mixed with the healthcare data, the AI can actually figure out who you are, where you are, what you've done, and tie it back to names. And so the study argues that HIPAA needs to be entirely revamped, because in the world of AI and healthcare, we're not actually protecting privacy anymore because of the way that the data tools. Now there's a consumer aspect of that, which is why I mentioned the GSK accessing 23andMe. I mean, I don't know how many of you have sent your data to 23andMe. I have my DNA at like 40 different genetic labs, just for comparison. It's fun to see. I'm doing my sensitivity and specificity analysis in the background. I get some weird stuff. One said, "You have red hair," and I was like, "That was part of your questionnaire." You need, like, that's not genetic based. But they, do consumers, there's a real privacy issue there. Do the consumers really know what information's being biobanked, and have we really consented to the use of our data in that way, and the transfer and access of it? And then if you add on this issue of what AI can do to piece back the information, can GSK figure out who I am and where I live based on the information that they got from 23andMe, and do I take certain drugs, and would I be a user in certain platforms? So I think there's definitely a concern about privacy, and also about how you acquire the data. On the really product-specific level, which I know is what Brent's asking me about, the size of the data that you use to train your product is really important. The size and the quality and the content of your training database. I've had all sorts of weird explanations given to me by clients and otherwise. One is that we first trained on the database, and then we went back and we ran a validation on the database. And I said, you can't validate on your training database. You have to train with something that's separate than your validation. And so that is, there's some new principles that we have to develop in documentation and software validation and being certain that are very specific to software. And you can't make mistakes like that, because now it's very expensive to go out and get a comparable database. So you need to segregate your database. You need to understand what data you have. You have to establish what your training database is. I think in the change control that you talked about, it's fascinating. Do we need to, when we do change control, go back and train on the original database? Or is there a new training database that we're doing? And how do you do comparability between the old version and the new version, and as versions evolve over time? This is very complex stuff, and you need data scientists, and you need good documentation. So I think to be continued.
Just a quick question. What about data bias? Do you see liability arising from data bias?
How do you guys think about that? Do you see data bias as a liability?
No, we could, but we're looking more at verifying data is adequate to support regulatory decisions. So the bias, by definition, needs to be addressed on the front end.
Got it. Diane, as long as you're speaking, I do have a question from the audience that I think you can address. It references an ISO. It says, how will companies use FDA PreCert? How will companies using the FDA PreCert process stay compliant with ISO 13485, which is harmonized to tradition design controls?
So the requirements for design controls is one thing. How you execute on it is a different matter altogether. So if you look at the GMPs, which will eventually be phased out and be replaced with 13485, you need to do it. It's the specificity around how we currently, for example, put together design history files, and tabs and tables of contents and thousands of pages. And so to for example, have traceability to your user stories within the software environment is the requirement. It's the traceability that you need to have. It doesn't mean you have to have physical binders to show that you meet those requirements. So it's not changing, they're not suggesting changing the fundamental requirements. They're just suggesting that there are appropriate ways that these things happen within the software environment just because they happen. Most people are moving to agile development processes. You might have to bolt a tool on here or there to make the traceability more visible. So you're not changing the requirements as much as you're changing how you meet the requirements.
Yeah, and FDA has been talking about this even in the 2013 guidance, the mobile medical app guidance. And that whole process, it says, the phrase better than I do, but there's a statement, we don't, if it's enforcement discretion, we may not require that you apply design controls or good manufacturing practices, but we highly suggest it. and I sound like a broken record when I'm talking to companies, is you may not feel like your product is regulated now, or we may not have clarity because we don't have a final CDS guidance or some areas that aren't still clear. But you should be employing the best practices possible in documenting, I call it good software practices, not good manufacturing practices anymore, but making sure that you're documenting this and able to show how you've developed, how you've made risk decisions, and what choices the software makes, and whether you've really assessed the end risk. And that is not always inherent in non-regulated software development. That's not always part of their process. The concept of risk and documenting risk. And so it is very hard as your product evolves and you realize, oh, look, when we take this data and we put it together, we can actually inform decision making. Maybe we are a regulated product. Oh, good Lord, going back and documenting that is not fun. It is an extraordinarily expensive endeavor. You may have to rewrite your code. I mean, you could really face a massive commercial halt if you haven't done it. So I think if you're thinking about, thinking ahead, you have to sort of project and almost assume, like, let's just act like we're regulated and figure out how to do it to that level of standard. And I'm sure investors would appreciate that.
I think there's, when we crosswalked the GMPs to software development processes, we were actually because we had a software development part of the company that was dealing with our non-regulated software. And when we did the crosswalk of the requirements, the GMP requirements versus what's actually just happening naturally within the software environment, there was a lot more overlap than we thought. There were far fewer holes that you would have to plug than I would have initially thought going into that exercise. So, a robust software development environment, it really already incorporates many of the aspects of the GMPs and ISO 13485. Risk is one of those things that are not overtly documented within the software environment that you would kind of have to add that, but there was a lot of overlap.
I was going to mention, for whoever asked that question and worried about ISO 1345, then I think you're worrying about the wrong thing. You should worry about how to do good engineering. And when you do good engineering, can you explain that good engineering to somebody else? So that is the biggest difference. So if you're able to explain why you make certain decisions, and if you memorize it all, that's great. But if you're able to point to somebody, if you don't rely on your memory, then you got to put it someplace so you can actually trigger that thought about when you made, you decided to go straight, but then you found something in the way to manage your risk, you had to go left. You made that choice. The reason you made the choice, you managed the risk in the right way, is that explainability concept to somebody else other than the guy actually at the keyboard coding. I think that's the biggest difference. So if you want to take the international perspective on quality systems or GMP or 1345, look at the IMDRF document. It's framed in a way that a software engineer should look at, the quality systems document that's at IMDRF. And it actually maps it back to 1345 and maps it back to the quality systems regulations in the US. So I would encourage you guys to take a look at that, because that's really what we're asking. And it starts off with this very fundamental thing. If you're doing good engineering, you should already have all of these things.
I will just say from a company building perspective, we've got some different schools of thought within our portfolio, and I think it varies depending on both your conservatism and the risk that of your solution out in the market. So we have, on one side, we have a business called HeartFlow that uses software to assess coronary artery disease. They run in an agile environment, and every sprint they have 6 to 7 people doing compliance documentation alongside that software sprint. And that's a stance of, I want to be prepared for a 510K level of scrutiny for every sprint that I do. And in that case, they've raised enough money and they have enough value in doing that successfully and enough risk out in the market that it makes business sense to do so. And another case that company Octave I was talking about earlier is leveraging AWS native services to do automated compliance tracking so that they can refer and it's auditable and all those things, and it provides a complete line of sight, but is a much more automated process. So you'll have to make your own determination on what makes business sense for you, but there are many different companies taking different approaches.
Another question from the audience, and maybe Diane, you can address to this. What are the established standard development organizations like ISO, IEC, ASTM, AAMI? What are they doing to create standards for AI software development?
There is some activity, but it's really kind of at the beginning stages. They haven't. The regulators seem to be more taking the forward look, more so than the standards organizations at this point. There's not a lot.
Because you mentioned good software development practices, and I dropped the good, but software development practices. I assume in the software community there's some concept of what that is.
Well, it's not like going to the GMPs where you say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's more conceptual that people. But as I said, it was, I thought if I asked 20 software developers, what does that mean? I'm going to get 20 completely different answers, and not really. There are some core fundamental approaches that just seem to constitute good practice.
So you guys should take the lead in developing the standards. Get out there, get working.
So another question from the audience that's specific to the FDA, and I'll just read the punchline. Is it necessary for an FDA submission to use US data?
I don't think it's necessary. I think, so we have guidances on how to use OUS data to prove your safety and effectiveness argument and applicability to the US population. I think it's the last part, applicability to the US population, and the population your product is intended to do is really the bottom line. And I think if you focus on that and say whatever you're intending to do, and is my study applicable to the population I'm intending to do, that's really what review consists of. They're looking for what you're planning to do or what your intentions are, what's your data, does it match? And if it matches and you have the confidence first, and then you can explain the confidence to a reviewer, I think that's really what's necessary. And how you get that, I mean, you export a bunch of US people to some other country and bring them back, bring the data back, it's up to you. It was a joke, by the way.
It's two aspects, though. It's the actual demographics of the patient population and sort of the health condition of the patients, if there's prevalence of disease, prevalence of conditions, and then it's also the way that clinical care is delivered in that setting, and were those normal standard interactions? Because a lot of what we're talking about with software, and especially AI-driven software, is workflow intervention, right? When did the physician get the information? Did it happen at a primary care? Is it happening at a specialist? And those workflows and the way that clinical care is delivered in other countries is often different. So it's not just the actual fields of patient demographics and disease prevalence, but it's also the workflow. And the workflow that you've established and studied in a different country is unfortunately going to probably be better and more efficient than in the US. And so you will have a challenge of the inefficiencies and some of the workflow challenges that we have in the US that make it hard to translate that. Usually you need to do some study or validation on US.
So Bethany is proposing that we not only ship the subjects over to another country, but also the hospitals over, and then bring them back.
And then bring them back. And therefore, no. You should be collecting the data in lots of different places. You should be studying this in other countries and seeing. You may learn things about the workflow and the way clinical care is delivered in that context that's applicable here. So I think you should be doing that. I just know we see a lot of feedback from reviewers that is very, you made it sound so easy, like, well, if the data matches, then you're good. There's pages and pages and pages of questions that come back from reviewers, really specific about the data and the workflow. So you have to really engage and grapple with that before you commit to an entirely OUS submission.
More questions for you, Bakul. Does the FDA require interoperability with the large electronic health record platforms and equipment manufacturers for software that's embedded within medical devices? And if not, why not?
So we actually have a guidance on that. If you haven't read it, you should probably read it. I think that proposed two principles. One is the message is we want interoperable systems. So if you are going to be, and the assumption is devices are now interconnected. So if you're interconnected, I think from a safety perspective, I think I would really want people to start thinking about how do you make it interoperable, because lack of interoperability actually does create risk situations where you could actually create a situation, and maybe not detectable immediately, but down the stream, you're creating a risk situation that may actually harm patients. So from our perspective is either you be transparent in what your protocol is and what your data you're sharing, so the user, again, I mean, you're going in the user in the sense of not only the person, but also the machine and the system that's going to intake your data from that medical device knows what to do with it. The fact that if it doesn't know what to do with it, it can actually, you may actually create a situation where when I say you, it's the product, right? So the product may create a situation that actually could potentially create harm. So our push has been is how do you keep it interoperable, which means that we're not asking you to like divulge all your IP. It's more about if you want the interface, which is electronic in this case, to be used just like you'd expect a user to use your physical interface in a proper way, we want the electronic interface to also be used in the proper way. So that's what we said in our guidance is if you're going to use standard base, which means everybody understand what's going back and forth on the interface, the electronic interface, or if you want to use a proprietary, we allow you to do that because we're not going to mandate you to use standards. We are saying that if you do that, just be transparent about what you allow. And then you have the third part is in your system, you should be interoperable, but at the same time, you need to make sure that cyber is also considered as part of that. Because you're not only being open to share data, but you also want to make sure that there's nothing malicious happening to your product that could raise those issues.
I think, everybody's moving towards things becoming more and more interoperable, with the obvious understanding that there's cybersecurity risks that go with that. The device not performing as intended, being a vector, the whole entire network being at more risk. And so we all understand that in order to get to these, better patient outcomes, that needs to become a reality. But the reality of the situation is a lot of medical devices are around for decades. And we've got tons of legacy devices that are sitting in hospitals now and will be for extended periods of time that you can't go back and bolt on interoperability and cybersecurity and hope it doesn't, a lot of these products are running on systems that aren't even supported anymore. And so, yes, we're moving that way, but there is going to be a lot of products that we can't get there just because they're large, they're capital equipment, they're around for a long time.
So one question, two more questions I have. I know it's 1 o'clock. The discussion paper that you issued, Bakul, has lots of questions, lots of food for thought. What's the timeline for trying to get answers to that and issue guidance?
I think we're going to look for input back on the docket. I believe it's 60 days, if I'm not mistaken. I think June is where it's, I don't know the exact date. I don't remember the exact date.
I think it's the 4th.
4th, that's right. That makes sense.
And then from there, until you issue a guidance, what's
I can't predict right now, but I anticipate those questions we asked in the discussion paper to spur a lot more conversations within the agency. I see multiple things happening, not necessarily just a direct to guidance. I think there is a call out for what should good machine learning practices be. So if you haven't gotten that call, take it to heart, because we're not expecting us to, hopefully you guys are not expecting us to sort of create good machine learning practices inside the FDA. I think this is a good machine learning community sort of effort that should be stood up, that could start building consensus around, and let's look beyond medical device or medical sector. Let's look beyond that and look at, well, machine learning has been around for a longer time, and figure out what does good engineering look like for that world. And then I think I also see other activities like how do you fold this paradigm of what we proposed into something that we can then say, from here onwards, this is what we need to do. And I think there'll be portions of it that I can see it turn into a guidance. I can see a draft guidance, obviously, first, and before we go to final. And there's portions of it I can see that becoming a standards activity that can sort of advance the field.
Anyone have any last thoughts they want to impart? If not, I want to thank the panel for a very stimulating discussion, and thank you all for submitting questions. Unfortunately, we couldn't get to all of them, but thank you. Thank you.